What is up, everyone? Welcome to this week's edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Yes, it's the international break. We still have plenty to talk about, though. We are going to get to the U.S. men's national team, set the stage for these final two friendlies before the World Cup squad is announced. And of course, the team actually goes to Qatar for their first World Cup since 2014. But before we do that, I want to take some time to talk about biggest winners and losers of the European season so far, with this being that first international break. It's a nice check in point. And my goal here is generally to highlight some of the teams that I don't talk about on a consistent, week in, week out basis because they're not necessarily the headline games in their league that the marquee matchups every single weekend. There are some big names in here, but there are also some teams I haven't gotten to talk about very much. So, without further ado, we will begin three winners, three losers. I cheated a little bit on winner number one. I'm just going to simply put the two teams at the top of the Serie A table together in Atalanta and Napoli. They're the only two undefeated teams left in Serie A. They have at least a 3-point cushion on every team in the league not named Udinese. And I did talk about this a little bit on Monday, this idea that they do have this cushion on the other five teams you look at as at least top four contenders, if not title contenders, depending on what year it is and how you feel about those clubs. Right? There are six traditional powers, if you will, in Italy. And then Atalanta have certainly thrown themselves into that category with their recent success. We'll stick with Atalanta first. And they were one of the most interesting teams in Europe to me heading into the season. I think I've mentioned this before. Just in the sense of, what do you do next? What happens when you do have that bad season? Right? They're not in European competition. They just stopped scoring a ridiculous amount of goals last season. And that defense was not fantastic by any stretch of the imagination. So all of a sudden, they went from being a really good team to being a rather average one. It really was that simple. If you look at their numbers from last season, it paints a very clear picture of what happened. Well, so far, things have been interesting because they've allowed 3 goals. That's the fewest in Serie A. We're still very early. I'm not entirely convinced they've all of a sudden turned into this terrific defensive team. The numbers also, if you look at expected goals, suggest that might not be the case. And they are scoring at a little bit lower rate than even last season. But this is a much more sustainable model for success if they can continue to perform this way and continue to win games this way. There is always that risk, and it's, quite frankly, it's what has prevented them from going to even greater heights. When you play so wide open and there are so many goals scored in your games, both by you and the other team, you just don't have a lot of control over things. It is the natural risk that comes with it. So sometimes things are going to go badly and it's going to cost you points that if you're a little more pragmatic, maybe you can find a way to sort of navigate games more effectively. And so far, that's what Atalanta are doing. They haven't been spectacular week in and week out, but they're getting the results they need. And so the raw numbers in terms of goal difference and stuff like that, and of course points, looks really good. And also part of this is probably the benefit of not having to deal with Europe. This is a team that I would argue has a lot of depth just because of the amount of players. It seems like every season, right? There are these new players coming in, guys getting back from loan deals across Europe. It's not like they're reliant on 11 guys. But now you have the ability to really focus solely on Serie A and just put all of your efforts there, that one game every week. And so far, it's paying dividends for Atalanta. On the Napoli side, still lead Serie A in shot creating actions and goal creating actions. Offensively, they've been absolutely terrific, and they haven't been too bad defensively. I expected Napoli to take a step back with everything they lost, but very quietly, they had a phenomenal transfer window when it was all said and done by the time the window closed. You don't have one striker, now you have 3. You certainly replaced Kalidou Koulibaly, and the way things have gone for him at Chelsea, maybe it ended up being a replacement. I'm hesitant to say that about Koulibaly because of how good he was for so long for Napoli. But these players, these club legends that have left, they're just not missing them. The players, and Victor Osimhen gets hurt, no problem. The other strikers step up. You still have your difference makers, your Peter Zelinskis of the world. And the other part of this, and why Napoli has to be one of my winners, is they are carrying the torch for all of Italy in European competition, not just the Champions League. The Europa League teams each have a bad loss. Fiorentina, not going well in the Europa Conference League. Lazio just got their doors blown off. Roma lost their first game. And then, of course, you have AC Milan have been fine. Inter have been disappointing. Juventus, we'll get to them in a minute. There is one team that is having so far, a very successful time in Europe, and that is Napoli. Never in a million years with that group and the circumstances surrounding the start of this season for Napoli did I think that would be the case. But here we are. They're off to a fantastic start. And the way these teams keep dropping points, this is a wide open title race. We need to get another 4 months into the season before I believe Atalanta and Napoli can actually go the distance with this and be there in the final games of the season contending for a title. That's what happened to Napoli last year, right? They were in this thing, and then all of a sudden, last month, 2 months of the season, it fell off the rails. You got to prove to me that's not going to happen again. But when you look at teams that have benefited from how things have gone so far, Atalanta and Napoli definitely near the top of that list. And we're just going to stay in Italy and talk about Juventus as the loser. It's just been so horrendous that I couldn't dismiss Juventus, even though I have talked about them before. I was trying to get some different teams in here. But 8th in the table, 7th in goals scored, 11th in expected goals per FBref, 11th in expected goals allowed, and 10th in expected goal difference. Dusan Vlahovic hasn't scored a goal from the run of play since the opening game of the season. He had those 2 brilliant free kicks, but in terms of actually just scoring a goal while the game is going on and the ball is not dead, is nowhere to be found. I have talked about some of this before in terms of their struggles, but you look at what is happening around them. With the vulnerabilities both Milan clubs have shown, Juventus should absolutely, regardless of whether you just, right, there's the argument that Juventus should always be contending for the Serie A title because they're Juventus, and there's certainly validity to that. But even just in the circumstances where Juventus are clearly in a rebuilding mode, the Milan clubs are in a really good place. But look at the points they've dropped already. The door is wide open for Juventus to get right back in there and, if not win the league, make a real run at it. And here they are, sitting in the middle of the table, and the Champions League has been an absolute disaster. They should be getting out of that Champions League group. Regardless of where they are, sort of in their cycle, they should be getting out of that group, even if they're not the Juventus that was getting to Champions League finals. Even if they're not anywhere close to that, which they aren't. You look at that and you expect them to be the second team in that group. And they are in real danger of that not happening because they've already lost a head-to-head at home with Benfica. Simply can't do it. Can't do it. So, I don't think there's too much that needs to be explained in this one. It's just kind of there written for you. You look at Juventus across any competition, and it's been disastrous from the very beginning. Basically from game one. And I was optimistic after the first couple. I was willing to forgive a draw. And I just can't, we're past the point of me saying I can't defend this anymore. It just continues to get worse and worse and worse. And it's a strange decision when you talk about Max Allegri too, just because at some point you have to back somebody to turn this around and actually have that hard conversation about we're just not where we need to be. We can't expect this to turn around quickly. Also, you need to make sure you get in the Champions League next season. It's not that this is disappointing, it's that this is disastrous. So if it continues, you're going to be in a really, really tough space when it comes to Max Allegri. As much as you may want to back him, you can't back anybody at the expense of not making the Champions League. Winner number 2, we're going to move to Germany, Union Berlin. No surprise here, considering they're the only remaining undefeated team in the Bundesliga. They are atop the Bundesliga at the moment. It is worth pointing out, though, they are 11th in the league with a minus 0.4 expected goal difference, again per FBref. However, 3 of their 5 wins have come by multiple goals. It's not like they are finding sort of bizarre ways to win these games. They are, by and large, performing at a level from a score standpoint representative of the points they have put up on the board. Jordan Pefok, Geraldo Becker have 9 goals and 6 assists in the Bundesliga between them. What I see when I look at these numbers and watch Union Berlin is this is a good example of why expected goals need to be taken with a grain of salt. If Pefok and Becker keep finishing at this rate and taking their chances the way they are, I mean, the difference between their individual expected goals and the goals they've scored is remarkable. They have been ruthlessly efficient. If that continues, this is a sustainable model. You don't have to win the XG battle every single game to be a good team. When you're not Bayern Munich, inherently, right, you're not, I mean, they're just not built to possess the ball 70% of the time and win the expected goals almost by default. Bayern's still winning the XG battle every single game. Nobody's arguing they're playing well right now. Right? It's about the quality of chances you create and your ability, and ultimately your ability to capitalize on the chances that are presented to you that you make for yourself. If you've got lethal strikers, 100% you can do it this way. The next team I'm going to talk about won a title doing it this way. The question is, can you do it for 25, 30, 34, ultimately 34 games? And there's also the part of this that, right, success for Union Berlin is not winning the Bundesliga. Getting into the Champions League would be a massive accomplishment, and they're in a really good position to do that. The other reason I wanted to include them in winners is the other teams that you're theoretically competing with for those final couple Champions League spots have not performed well by and large. It's not just that Union Berlin have been great. It's that they're in a terrific position, regardless of whether they can sustain this or not. If they can just play well enough, they're going to end up in the Champions League next season. And that's a massive win. So there's that part of it too. And the final thing I want to say, yeah, the Europa League hasn't gone great. It's not shocking, right? There's a track record of teams not used to having those midweek games, struggling to kind of put everything together and stay competitive in all of the different competitions they're in. But there is still plenty of time to turn that around and find. All you got to do is just get out of your group and go from there. Maybe it doesn't happen. Obviously, they're in a bad spot. But it's not like the European adventure is already over for them either. Loser number 2, Leicester City. I was honestly expecting to be talking about a managerial change here. So we'll talk about the team instead. Minus 12 goal difference. They've allowed 22 goals in 7 games. And they are already 3 points back of it. At least 3 points back of every other team in the Premier League. Now, some context is important here, and I want to start with this before we get to all of the bad. 7 games, 5 of which came against Arsenal, Chelsea, Manchester United, Tottenham, and Brighton. That does need to be part of the conversation here. And they nearly got a point against Chelsea. Now, they also gave up 2 goals up a man. They weren't bad against Arsenal. They just conceded the goal both times they actually scored to get back into the game. They didn't really offer much offensively against Manchester United, but they were in that game. You could argue they outplayed Tottenham in the first half. Now they gave up 4 goals in the second half. They had a lead against Brighton. I mean, it lasted for all of 10 minutes or something. So when you look at that and you look at some of the performances, the other part of this story is the blown leads. Not against these 5 teams necessarily, but specifically in some of the other games when you talk about, right, drop points. You had Brentford opening day of the season. Same thing against Southampton. They are not getting outplayed for 90 minutes. So there's a very easy way for me to see how this gets turned around quickly. And that starts with the very soft schedule they have coming up here, which is why I thought this was the perfect time to make the managerial change, because these are the games you got to pick up points. They got a brutal start. They didn't handle it well. Now you got to regroup and start getting some points on the board. The other part of this is James Maddison's the only player on this team with multiple goals in the Premier League. The striker position is unsettled at this point. Vardy has been okay, but he really has not gotten any of those. I mean, I can think of maybe one really good chance he's had this season. It is entirely possible this is the year where he falls off the cliff and Father Time finally gets the better of him. And absolutely, you should not be starting him every game the way things have gone so far. And to Brendan Rodgers' credit, he has not. He's tried some other things. But somebody needs to be, Harvey Barnes needs to be chipping in goals. The striker position needs to be a little bit more productive. You do have James Maddison playing really well, though, and that's a good starting point. The problem is nobody is really supporting him at this point. And the bottom line with this is, and I was sort of planning again to save some of this for when the managerial change happened, but I'll bring some of it out here. I understand the transfer window, that you had to sell Wesley Fofana to get a player in that was going to actually contribute to your team. Yes, that is frustrating. That is a problem. That does not explain going from a team that in a disappointing season finished 8th and got to a European semifinal to the worst team in the Premier League through 7 games. You will never be able to convince me this roster is a relegation candidate. I don't care if they get relegated. This squad is not relegation material. There are too many really gifted players. From Maddison to Barnes to Tillmans. You can throw Vardy in there, but you don't even have to. I mean, that midfield, and Kieran Dewsbury-Hall is very quickly becoming a good player too. Wilfred Ndidi hasn't been himself yet, so I'm not going to put him in that conversation. But there's too much talent. Brendan Rodgers has to be getting more out of this team. Plain and simple. To me, the transfer window conversation has to be had in the context of realistic expectations for this season and this idea that Leicester is supposed to be the team pushing the top 6 and fighting for European spots with the West Hams of the world. That is where you can have a conversation about the transfer window. That is not an explanation, much less an excuse for how horrific they've been defensively. It just isn't. That's the part of this that needs to get fixed. I still ultimately think they're going to be fine. The schedule has certainly had a part to play in this. They're not that far off. Certainly behind schedule, but not as behind schedule as it might look. But certainly teams that have gotten off to bad starts. Leicester's right at the top of the list. We'll stay in England for our final winner. Unsurprisingly, that is Arsenal. And I put Arsenal here for a more specific reason than, oh, look, they're atop the Premier League. Good for them. Yes, I understand they don't have any impressive wins, and that was sort of the narrative coming out of the Manchester United game was, well, here's what happened when they played a real team. A game which they had a questionable goal taken away that would have been an opener. They did equalize. They played well. And they just didn't happen to win at Old Trafford. I mean, we got to put this in the right context. I didn't see anything coming out of that game that worried me about Arsenal. And coming with the whole strange scheduling due to the Queen's passing and the way things sort of shut down for a minute there, coming out of that Manchester United game and then getting a convincing win was massive. Because I talked about this in my Premier League preview. Arsenal's rough patches last season, right? The very beginning, the end of the season when they blew that top 4 spot, all sort of bunched together in these small little patches. All of their losses. They didn't just lose a game here and lose a game there. They lost 3-4 straight and then played really well for a while and lost 3-4 straight or 4 of 6 or whatever. That is the difference between finishing 5th and 6th or finishing, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and maybe even 1st. Still not convinced they can actually challenge for this title. So you got a disappointing loss in which you played well, and you came back and you took care of business. They have beaten every single team, not gotten points against them, beaten every single team they've supposed to this season. Manchester City can't say that. There's not another team in the Premier League, I would argue. I haven't actually sort of gone through and thought about that, and especially a team of Arsenal's stature who expects to win basically every time they take the field. Nobody else can say they've done exactly what they're supposed to so far. And then the final part of this, from a squad standpoint and a depth standpoint, which is a place Arsenal have sort of come up short in the past during this darker period since Arsene Wenger left. There's one person that comes to mind that I'm actually worried about Arsenal losing if I'm an Arsenal fan. That's Gabriel Jesus. He's been spectacular. He's a perfect fit. That was the piece that was missing. He is everything they expected and then some so far. Not having him for an extended stretch would worry me. But outside of that, I mean, you're talking about your other most important players here. Okay, Martin Odegaard, certainly. Emile Smith-Rowe is having difficulty getting playing time right now, let alone actually get into the starting lineup. Not that I'm going to sit here and say Emile Smith-Rowe is a competent replacement or an equal replacement for Martin Odegaard. But I don't feel terrible if that's the player you're bringing into the starting lineup. And it might not even be him if for some reason you do lose Odegaard. You have 3 center backs, one of whom is playing right back, which is then preventing your quality right back from getting on the field. You have 2 left backs. Every position. And, they've used multiple, we're up to probably 4 or 5, I think 5, fairly regular contributors at least in the midfield so far. It's not like it's 11 guys and then the squad falls off. They are prepared to handle a Europa League run. They're prepared to handle injuries, and that's not something you can necessarily say about Arsenal previously. But this is what happens when you're able to build a good roster, hold on to that roster, and then not just settle for that, but continue to build on top of it, which is exactly what they've done in bringing in a guy like Gabriel Jesus. You got to give managers time to figure this out, especially when they're young ones. I will give Arsenal all the credit in the world for sticking with Mikel Arteta when they would have been applauded by their fan base for firing him. You are not going to change everything that needs to be changed at a club in a position like Arsenal was overnight. Find somebody who you think is the guy moving forward and actually give them a chance to prove what they can do. Don't just make them your next scapegoat. when everything clicks and you finally get this cohesive unit from top to bottom in terms of your leadership, this is what happens. Loser number 3, Sevilla, 15th in La Liga, 1 win, third most expected goals allowed in La Liga. And then Champions League wise, yes, they got the draw with Copenhagen. That leaves them in an okay spot in that group. They've got a good chance to get that Europa League third place finish, which is as good as you could expect in that group, considering who else is in it. So that's not really where I'm going with this. Where I'm going with this is this team has had 3 straight fourth place finishes, 9 straight seasons they have finished in the top 8 of La Liga. They are 15th right now, and they are conceding goals and quality chances left and right. The center back replacement has not worked. That's not necessarily a criticism of anybody in particular, be it the people assembling the squad or the players who have come in to replace Jules Koundé and Diego Carlos. It's just an unfortunate reality of being a club like Sevilla that they almost did too good of a job. And then you have to go do it again when ultimately the bigger clubs go and poach your players that you found. And sometimes you don't get it right and you pay a price for it. They have played Barcelona and Villarreal, plus Osasuna, who's off to a good start. So the schedule has not been incredibly easy where they're losing games to all these teams they have no business losing to. And again, there is plenty of time to turn this thing around and still finish at a respectable spot. I'm not worried about them getting relegated. But they have lost 7-0 combined against Manchester City and Barcelona. To me, that's just not something I associate with Sevilla. They don't necessarily win those games, but they're competitive. They make it difficult. And so far, that just hasn't happened. So that's really why I have them as a loser here, is the way they have started and how bad it's been has forced me to reevaluate what I expect from this club, at least in the short term this season. Because I, at the beginning, was more than happy to give them the benefit of the doubt. And, I had them in my preseason top 25, right where they kind of always are, that 15 to 18, 15 to 20 range. Fourth best team in La Liga. They have been so consistent with that. And now you're in a position where you have work to do to make sure you even get into the Europa League. Because you could find yourself out of Europe here after the group stage of the Champions League, the way things have gone. And you're in danger of having one of those blah seasons where you're maybe trying to make a push at a Conference League spot or something, but that's not where this team is supposed to be. Maybe they turn this around quickly and get right back into at least a Europa League conversation. Maybe they drop to the Europa League and find a way to win the competition. Who knows? But it is fair to wonder at this point, is Sevilla still Sevilla? And that's ultimately why I have them as one of my losers.